how do we know we made a right decision if nothing went wrong?
5:50 a.m. Pack all necessary gear. Transceiver, probe, shovel, down jacket, first aid kit, skins. I always want to know the product I'm using works 100% of the time, because then I can rely on it for every day I spend in the backcountry. Being well trained in avalanche rescue and knowing that I use the best avalanche safety equipment on the market adds extra security to my day. I want to learn how to play safe and ski another day.
Awesome. So thanks, Mammut, for supporting tonight's NSAW. So now I'd like to hand off the evening to our moderator, who is NSAW's Outreach and Communication Manager, Molly Scudder. Molly's been with NWAC for a little over a year now, and she has spent a lot of work and time putting together NSAW, and so we really appreciate it, and I'd like to hand the mic over to you, Molly. Thanks.
Thanks, Scott. Thank you to our panelists and attendees for joining us this evening. Our first presenter tonight is Dr. Sara Boilen. Dr. Boilen is a clinical psychologist and the owner of Sweetgrass Psychological, a community-minded practice elevating the mental wellness of Montanans located in Whitefish, Montana. Her professional interests include grief, mindfulness, and complicated personalities. Her personal interests include mountaineering, telemark skiing, running on trails, and eating desserts on top of mountains. The confluence of her personal and professional worlds can be found in avalanche terrain, where she is fascinated by human behavior, decision-making, and group communication and dynamics. Dr. Boilen has researched and published on the ages of avalanche fatality victims. She's spoken on the subject of human factors and has written for the Avalanche Review. Her presentation tonight is titled Human Behavior and Communication in Complicated Time and Terrain. If you've taken your level 1, I'm sure you remember how frequently communication was addressed as a pillar of backcountry safety. And for me, the more time I've spent in the backcountry, the more I realize that communication looks really different depending on environmental factors and who you're with. So I'm really looking forward to this talk. And Sara, I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you so much, Molly. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm going to frame this conversation this evening around how your brain is a double agent, and maybe even more honestly, how your brain is out to get you. So when Ian McCammon kind of introduced the backcountry world to the field of both psychology and also behavioral economics, he really highlighted several of the heuristic traps that we've become super familiar with. We know facets, we know them really well. And so my hope is to sort of expand on that tonight. So this first slide, which I do not expect you to be able to read, I just put it here to kind of highlight, this is a summary of all of the identified cognitive biases or heuristic traps that behavioral economics or psychologists have established, researched, thought about, theorized, etc. And they kind of fall into 4 different categories. So our brain works pretty hard to process all of the information that comes at us in a day or even in a moment. And there's no possible way that our brain can do all of that. It would require too much energy, too much focus. We would literally never be able to leave the house, right? And so there's 4 kind of styles of our brain kind of processing when it needs to use one of these traps or one of these mental shortcuts. So the first is when we're not sure what we should even be remembering. So there's kind of just like a lot coming at us and we're like, I don't really know. And then there's also when our brain needs to act really quickly and our brain uses these shortcuts to get from point A to point B in the spirit of kind of doing that quickly. And when we do things quickly, we often lose some of the nuance or the specifics, or maybe even really important details. There are also cognitive biases that come in when we don't really have enough meaning, we don't really know exactly what this means. How do we interpret this? So this occurs, after you've taken your AVI 1, say, and you know a little bit about what you should be looking for in your pit, or you know a little bit about, terrain management, but maybe you don't know quite enough to make all the connections. And so your brain just kind of jumps to conclusion. And then finally, a huge area of using cognitive biases or cognitive traps is when we just have too much information. And that is really common in the backcountry, or really just in our day-to-day life, right? So there's just so much coming at us, and we have to kind of like break it down and discern different things. And so we do that as best we can, and we do that as quickly as we can, but we don't always do it efficiently. And sadly, these strategies that we have for like doing things better or faster or more efficiently sometimes lead to our demise. So tonight, I'm going to focus on a few of the particularly important or salient ways that your lazy brain kind of deals with things. And we know that the brain gets lazier the more uncertainty that's available to us. And so, of course, that's a real problem when we're traveling in the backcountry. And so I've been thinking a lot about risk and how we make decisions, and thinking about that in the time of Corona, right? Because there's so much happening in these weird, wild, uncertain times, and all of the uncertainty is making us make assumptions more and more and more. And so stay tuned with me as I sort of think the first half of my talk is going to feel kind of demoralizing, because I'm basically just going to share all the ways in which your brain really is out to get you. And then halfway through, we're going to pivot and we're going to talk about some strategies to maybe do things a little bit better. So before we dive in, and I know this isn't interactive, but I'm going to try to make it as interactive as possible. So take out a piece of paper or a note on your phone, or even just mentally kind of jot down 3 memorable moments from sliding on snow in the last year. And you don't have to write out the whole memory, but just kind of like that one time, or my birthday, or that time with Kim, or whatever it is, just kind of jot it down. And we're going to come back to that, I promise. So we're going to start, and you're going to see that I really love rhyming. It's one of my favorite pastimes, in addition to eating dessert on top of mountains. So I've given you a rhyme for every heuristic that I'm going to introduce, in the spirit of helping you remember them, because there's also a heuristic where rhyming makes things easy to remember. So this is one of those examples in which your brain is actually going to serve you for the better. So we base our decisions on whatever information is available to us. So I remember kind of early on in the time of Corona, one of my friends who was an ER nurse locally kept saying, guys, COVID is here. COVID is here. I promise, you have to trust me. And what was interesting was that nobody knew anybody with COVID. And so in some ways, it felt as if COVID didn't really exist. And maybe some of you, especially those of you in mountain towns, maybe you felt that initially as well. So the information that's in front of us, no one has COVID, is in disagreement with the information that I'm being told. But my brain is going to go with what I see, because that's what it does. It just looks for that shortcut. And so our memories, so not only like what's right in front of us, but our memories can also be like kind of the warehouse that our brain goes for information on what is most likely to occur. So when we're trying to figure out like, is this going to happen or is this going to happen? Our brain kind of looks through all of its memories. It's exactly how your brain works. It just looks through its memories and it says, I know how this is going to go. So looking back over your list of 3, probably some of you wrote things like Bluebird Powder Day, or Beautiful Day Out with Friends, or Best Turns I've Had All Year, etc. And maybe some of you, and I've done this with large groups over the years, often a way smaller percentage, write down something about an avalanche. And obviously that'll depend on if you're a professional, if you do avalanche mitigation, etc. But generally speaking, most of us, because nature is this terrible feedback loop, most of us don't have a lot of information or memories that would suggest that an avalanche is going to occur today. So the availability heuristic is a really dangerous one, because when we look back and we look forward, we don't see avalanches. And so that's not what we're expecting. Okay, so next is, and I'm going to do this really quick. So next is the anchoring bias. So one of the easiest ways that our brain kind of processes all the information that comes at us is that we prioritize the first bit of information that we receive on a subject or a topic or an experience. So I always go back in my mind to this one day I had met my crew for skiing at the local coffee shop. We were meeting kind of right before 7. We were going to get together and then head out. And there were like 3 other groups who were all doing that. So we were all in line, and at 7 is when our local forecast comes out. And somebody said like, oh, has anybody seen the bulletin for the day? So I pulled it up on my phone. It looked a lot like this. I held it up. This is where you learn that psychologists are just people too, because I totally am like, oh, I'm going to help everybody fall for this great trap that I know about. And so in that moment, I was anchoring everybody to this idea that the day was going to be green, right? And so that means that throughout the day, everyone in that coffee shop was filtering all the incoming information through their lens of green. So does this mean that their brain might be ignoring bits of information that don't match up with green conditions? Definitely. This is the sabotage that your brain engages in all the time. And this is incredibly problematic if we don't do things to counter it. The craziest part of, I think, of anchoring is that it teams up with its nasty little cousin confirmation bias. And it really writes this story that always defends our original hypothesis. So our original hypothesis is green. And then confirmation bias comes in and is like, I'll help you, brain. I will help you see exactly what we expect, right? Here's your rhyme. And your brain wants to be right. So I don't just mean that in like, oh, you have such a hard time being wrong. I mean that literally, like our brains want to be right. They don't want to work harder than they need to work. And because if they are wrong, you just start all over. And so confirmation bias is like this secret weapon to keep you from making evidence-based decisions. And if you've seen The Social Dilemma by now, which if you haven't, maybe later tonight, you should give it a watch. You'll see how social media exploits this heuristic trap. And what's interesting, I know there's more and more research and more conversation around social media's impact on backcountry users. But right now it's October in Montana, there's snow on the ground. I keep scrolling through my feed and seeing all these photos of people making awesome turns. You would almost expect, right? So there's the anchoring that's what I'm going to find when I go out. I know that there's actually a lot of bush out there though. That is not what I'm going to find. I'm not going to find beautiful powder right now. Maybe up high, but I'm going to have to work to get it. So because your brain is working as little as it possibly can, right? Because more effort equals more energy equals more calories needed. Your brain is going to ignore, distort, or misinterpret information in the spirit of maintaining its original hypotheses, right? So your brain is basically just a lazy scientist who never went through peer review. So if you haven't been demoralized enough, we're going to talk about 2 more, and then I promise it'll get positive. So one of the things we know is that we really like to kind of do what we always have done or what we set out to do, right? So if we plan for a plan A, that is what we're going to do. And we do that even if circumstances change. And so if I've said, I'm going to go to the top of this mountain and ski that line, it's going to take a lot of mental energy to convince my brain away from that. And so, they're kind of like, this trap is almost like we don't even know that it's happening. And most of the time, just like many of these traps, the end result is positive, right? And so it takes a lot of work to even notice that we're falling for it. Okay, the other thing that is really important to know about your brain is that it is wired for acceptance. So even if you're like a super introverted, you secretly hate people kind of person, your brain is still wired for human connection. It's like a fundamental aspect. You're just going to have to trust me on this because we don't have time to get into it tonight. And because we're so keen on connection, we are also really aversive to shame. So shame and connection kind of can't really live in concert. And if we want connection, we have to avoid shame. And so we avoid things that, even if they might save our lives or our partner's lives, we will avoid saying them or asserting them in the spirit of protecting ourselves from feeling shame. And you know, if you're going out with groups of people who are new to you, maybe you're really seeking their specific acceptance because they have a snowmobile and you really want to get invited again, or maybe it's a crush, or maybe it's somebody who's just like a little notch better than you and you want to impress them. This might be something to really watch out for, because it's very possible that this will be activated without you even noticing it. And you know, I feel like with COVID, I was just talking to a friend about this the other day, people got COVID and they didn't want anybody to know, right? And the reason for that is because of shame. We are so worried about being ostracized that we will avoid. So this fact is kind of what's at the heart of groupthink. And this sort of, you know, dilemma or shortcut or strategy of your brain is really adaptive, right? Because we do need that connection, but it can also be super problematic if it leads us to not really be honest. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some strategies to avoid catastrophes. All right, so just to yourself, no one's even looking because we can't see you. Raise your hand if you want to go out this weekend and do plan A, holler. And raise your hand if you want to do plan B, right? We all know that we want to do plan A, even if we don't know what it means, right? We don't even know where plan A is going. So we're so conditioned to think like that. Let's just change it up. So my recommendation is that you always make 2 plans for the day. And I would call them plan N and plan K. So plan K is going to be skiing here, and plan N is going to be riding here. And we are going to talk about them as if they are equally delightful, even if they're not. And what's also really important is that we sort of pave the way to eliminate that defaulting bias, right? By sort of like tricking ourselves into, or forcing ourselves to do the work, right? So we're going to look at our map, or we're going to look at our plans for the day, and we're going to decide where are the decision points in the day. The first decision point might very well meet at the car or at the coffee shop, because you can't really, you know, one plan is over here and one plan's way over on the other side of the valley. That's fine. But if they're in a shared area, maybe you plan a decision point, you know, halfway up that ridge or on the ridge where you really can make a good decision. And the importance in this, right, is that you're sort of like circumventing your brain's laziness and its attempt at sabotaging you by asserting yourself in advance before you get even into the situation, right? Because once we start the ball rolling, then it's going to be much harder. Okay, so next up, this is my favorite to combat anchoring and confirmation bias and the availability heuristic. So I would suggest that you always assign a devil's advocate. So this person, like my good friend Meg here, should be knowledgeable and confident enough to speak up, right? So this should be a leader type, and ideally somebody who knows their stuff in the backcountry and who has enough sort of clout with the group that they're not going to be really shy. I would also say it's great if this is the person in the lead, like maybe this is your fittest person, because often the person in the back is out of breath by the time they catch up with the group and they can't even speak, right? And this person's going to spend their whole day arguing with the group. So the group says things look good, and this person is going to highlight some data points that show how things don't look good. You agree that you're going to press on, and this person is going to say, you know, maybe we shouldn't, and here's why. So this isn't just arguing, this is arguing with data. And we're really trying to kind of, once again, disrupt those systems of jumping to conclusions and making things simple. And it's going to be super annoying, but this is like the only way to deal with these spies that are living in our brain, that are infiltrating our systems of safety. So Another great one, which has been in the literature, and many of you are probably familiar with it, is doing some form of premortem analysis. So in the time of COVID, I find myself doing this a lot. So I get invited somewhere or somebody else wants to do something, and I sort of think to myself, like, if one of us got sick, like, how would I feel about this decision that we made? And will I look back and think like, yeah, we made good choices, we mitigated risk? Would I be proud of the decisions I made? And one of the ways I kind of try to imagine this when I'm in the backcountry is if I had to call my partner's mother and or partner or child and explain to them our decision making throughout the day that led to some disaster, like how would I feel making making those statements and asserting our choices? And this is really dark, and my brain happens to like dark humor, so I try to lighten it up a little bit, but I love to imagine the headlines that are, in the paper the next day, or what's the summary in the avalanche accident report that's going to be featured, right? And my partner works for the Forest Service, and he said, oh, we do this all the time. Our favorite headline is like, local Forest Service boobs drive truck into ditch, right? So they're just sort of making light of it, but in a way that is allowing them to see their fallibility. I find that when I'm out with my fellow friends who are avalanche instructors, I tend to make headlines that say something like, local avalanche educators spend cold night out without sleeping pad or tea that they tell everyone else they should bring. So you should be thinking like, what would your headline read? What would, be the findings in that avalanche accident report? And how embarrassed would you feel about those things? So again, doing this not only is like a fun exercise to do when you're in the skin track, if you like dark humor, it also kind of makes these short circuit so that they can't actually do what they're trying to do. Great. And then at the end of your tour or your ride, you need to be debriefing. So remember that memory exercise that we did earlier. So we remember things that we review, and we remember them how we review them. So I think the concept of type 2 fun has been like a totally wonderful thing for ultra runners and many athletes, right? Because it's given us this framework to remember things with a slightly more positive edge than maybe we would have otherwise. The problem is that we all know that the hardships and blisters and pain kind of erodes with time, and it leaves us with this scrubbed version of history that glimmers and shines in our memory banks. So then when our brain goes to look at like, what do we think is going to happen based on what has already happened? Suddenly we think it's going to be all the time a bluebird powder day with friends. And that's just like food for the availability heuristic monster, right? So when you debrief, don't just tears and don't just say that was awesome. Talk about the close call. Talk about what you didn't find in the snowpack that you thought you were going to. Talk about the monsters that you were nervous about lurking beneath. What about that slough made you uncomfortable? What about that wind slab you saw? And really highlight those things and seal them into your memory bank so that you can come back to them the next time. Oh, sorry, I don't know how that got in there. Okay, so that's all I have. Now we're up for questions.
Thanks, Sarah. Sorry, it took me a
Yeah.
second.
Yeah, no worries.
That was awesome. So I actually have a quick question right off the bat. In group dynamics, do you ever see, I think oftentimes you like expect everyone to be on the same education plane as you, having had a level 1, a level 2. And how do you see when you're going out with a group and everyone has a varying degree, like level of education, and then also different experience types, how that plays into those roles that you're playing and that devil's advocate? Obviously you want to go with someone that's the most experienced, but what does that experience actually mean? Is that education, or is that time spent in the backcountry, or is it a combination? And how do you kind of like siphon through that?
That's a great question, Molly. I mean, I think it's interesting, and I know actually Eric Peitsch is going to talk about this later because it's some of the research I was involved in. But so experience doesn't always necessarily mean that we're better decision makers. And in some ways, some of the heuristics that form over time can be really problematic the longer we've done something. And so we should be empowering all group members to realize that they have really important information, right? And we all know that like as you grow in your knowledge, you like lose and gain confidence kind of along the way. And depending where you are, you might not speak up. And I really like using that, like all to go, one for no is great, but also just shifting the way you converse. So asking questions like, rather than saying, does everyone feel good about this? Asking who doesn't feel good about this? Or does anyone not feel good about this, right? And making sure that we're really pulling that out of every single person and making it really clear that intuition is actually a really helpful thing. And we actually know that the less experience you have in some ways, the more we can trust your intuition. So making it clear that like, if somebody has a bad feeling, we're going to trust that. We're going to listen to it. We're going to honor it. But yeah, also just to say, so assigning the devil's advocate to the most competent, experienced person, like whoever that is, sort of levels the playing field and gives other people an opportunity to step up. And I really like how that happens as well.
Yeah. Okay. And also just to follow up, can you briefly explain what a heuristic is?
So a heuristic is just sort of that shortcut that our brain is using. It's like a way of seeing certain things or interpreting certain bits of information that fits into a preconceived notion, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a real thing. It's just in your head.
Let's see, we have, do you have a case study or personal story you use most often to illustrate this topic?
I think every time you go out with me. I mean, I think we all do. But yeah, I mean, I think like I'm guilty of a lot of these things and I could share probably, or I know some of my ski partners are on here. They could probably share some of their stories of me too. But yeah, and I think the biggest one really is like and in one of my other talks, I talk a lot about just knowing yourself and knowing what your traps really are. And I'm a peak bagger. As soon as I get to a ridge and I see a summit, I need to be on that summit. And if my turnaround time is 1:30 and it's 2, I'm still going to try for that summit. And so I think just really knowing like what your traps are. Yeah, Jenny, my ski partner, just shared that. I want to make it to the peak every time.
Julian is wondering if you have any thoughts on the impact of group size on the effectiveness of applying these strategies.
Yeah, so my other rhyme would be like in groups larger than 3 or 4, we tend to risk more. So I think the larger your group size, the less you're going to be able to communicate effectively, the less you're going to hear everybody's voice, the more likely it is that you're going to start defaulting or going to the halo effect, right? Because in groups that can't kind of lead themselves, you're going to elevate one leader. And I find personally that that tends to happen in groups like larger than 3 or 4.
Rosemary has a question about shame. It seems like some of the strategies to avoid catastrophes could also risk evoking shame. How do we avoid shame in those strategies so that we don't contribute to the problems you mentioned associated with shame aversion?
Yeah, that's great. And I think a lot of that comes into how you set the tone, right? And how you have those conversations. And you know, if you say, like, if I say to my partners, I know that I'm a peak bagger, I know that I'm going to want to get to the top of this mountain, and you have full permission to check me or tell me no, and really making it clear that we're going to have this conversation as much as we need to and as often as we need to is really helpful. I also think like, using humor for me can really be like a shame reducer. So the funnier we can make this and like we can share these ridiculous headlines, maybe the lighter everyone will feel to kind of chime in. And I often like tend to talk myself down and I'm like, well, I don't know anything. Like I'm, you know, just a brain also doing all these stupid things. And that way everybody doesn't feel like, oh, like there's the psychologist talks about this stuff. Like we can't, you know, be bad at this.
Yeah. What is the most interesting thing you've found in one of your trip debriefs? Any times that you've said, wow, that was a silly decision?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, the one that comes to mind immediately is not from winter, from summer, trying to climb a mountain. And we were like exiting in the dark and it was pouring rain and we were like kind of down climbing these little cliffs. And at one point I was like, I think we're done. We just need to bivvy here. Like we can't keep moving. And we did. My partner was really unhappy with my decision, but was willing to do it. And we woke up in the morning and got down around the next band of cliffs and realized we had been on top of like a 40-foot cliff. Like if we had kept moving, it would have been real shady. And I think in that debrief, talking about how both of us were nervous and uncomfortable that whole way leading up to that. And I had been really anxious to like raise the flag and say like, we're done. And that actually that was like kind of relieving, like to my partner. And I think often we get in our heads and we think like, we don't want to be that person. And so I think it comes down to a lot of those social things more than like the data, but that like when somebody speaks up, everyone else was feeling it too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We've seen this question come up in a couple of different ways tonight. How do you be the devil's advocate, the negative one, without overdoing it? I think oftentimes you can get a boy who cried wolf situation where people can't tell how concerned to be about the points you're raising.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I do think that's where it comes back to using data, right? So you're not just sort of saying like, I don't know if that's a good idea. I don't think this is a good idea. You're actually saying like, I saw bullseye data, or I saw this in the snow pit. And I know you all thought that wasn't a big deal, but I think we should come back to that bit of data. Or yeah, it is getting kind of late and the winds are picking up way more than we expected. Like, let's talk about that. And so it comes back to like this thing that we get to talk about. And the goal isn't to like disrupt the flow of the group or make it feel really impossible to move forward. It's that we are just counterbalancing our brain's attempts at confirming our hypotheses by providing a little bit of data that might balance things out.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I think we've got time for about 2 more questions. Alyssa is wondering if you have any go-to formats for daily debriefs.
What did you notice? That would be like my favorite question. I'm a therapist, so like asking questions kind of comes naturally, I guess. But I think asking like, what did you notice? Like, what was the thing you didn't say that you wish you had said? How was everybody's comfort level throughout the day? I really like asking like, how do you think we move together as a group? So that we can kind of, solicit some information about this group's dynamics. And I also feel like some of my partners who I go out with regularly, we just kind of like talk about it. Like, what did you think about that route we took? Would you do that again? That's another great question. Would you do that again?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, and I guess we'll take the last question, and we've seen this one come up a few times. Do you have any recommended resources to help us learn more?
The Avalanche Review, I think, is a great publication, and everybody should make sure they have their membership and they get the Avalanche Review. So that initial screen that I shared, the codex, the cognitive bias codex, is actually on Wikipedia, which feels really weird to like use that for every presentation I ever give, but it's the best format, and it's a living document. You can click all of the biases and they link you to descriptions of them. So if you want to geek out on cognitive biases, you really can. My favorite 2 books on the subject of heuristics or cognitive biases are Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow and Predictably Irrational. I think those books really help us understand. And I think it's Predictably Irrational actually talks about Ian McCammon's work in the book. And so it's a wonderful, they're a little heady, but they're really easy to get into. And so if you're interested, that would be a great one.
Okay, great. Yeah, we had A3, the American Avalanche Association, actually present on Tuesday. And they also touched upon TAR. So if anyone's rewatching the recorded sessions after we wrap up, I would highly recommend watching that one as well. Okay, well, great. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was really informative.